Okay, started.
Welcome all NYU students and students around the world. My name is Eder Radziwiłowski, Deputy Opinion Editor at Washington Square News. On behalf of WSN, thank you, Professor Chomsky, for doing this interview. I also want to extend a special thanks to the Liberal Studies program for their support and to my fellow student Alice Sholto-Douglas for her collaboration in the project and technical assistance today. Despite the impending blizzard and a cold, Professor Chomsky has generously obliged to readjust his schedule for this interview, for which we are indescribably grateful. Before I begin with the questions, I just want to note for the viewers that Professor Chomsky is the 8th most cited scholar of all time, joining the ranks of Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, and Freud. So on to my first question, and this is a topic that specifically concerns me as a student. Since the start of the Occupy movement, many protesters have put matters concerning rising tuition costs and student loans among the top of their demands. During her campaign, Jill Stein provocatively compared student debt to a modern form of indenture. And you have expressed a similar view, arguing that student indebtedness is a technique of indoctrination and control. Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, the first question that arises is whether there's an economic necessity for student debt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't have to tell students what the numbers are.
Right.
It's over $1 trillion. It's beyond credit card debt. So is there an economic justification? Well, there are a number of ways of testing that. So, for example, we happen to be right next door to a poor country, Mexico. Quite a good university system. Mm-hmm. Doesn't have all the things we have. It's a poor country, but very high quality, high level of instruction. I've taught there, been there. Mm-hmm. It's free. Mm-hmm. There was an attempt by the government some years ago, 10, 15 years ago, to raise costs slightly. Led to a national student strike. The country was practically closed down, and they backed off. In fact, last time I was there, about 2 years ago, there was an administration building that was still occupied by students from the student strike long before it had been turned into a community center. That's Mexico, a poor country. Just in our northern border in Quebec, where tuition is higher than Mexico, there is tuition, but it's not at our level. There was an attempt by the government a couple of months ago to raise the tuition. There was a student strike in Quebec, joined by much of the population. It led not only to backing off on that proposal, but actually to a change in the government. A lot of changes, the protests against neoliberal policies and much more. There are rich countries that have very high level educational systems. Among the highest are Finland and Germany, both free. If you go back in American history, you go back to the 1950s, it's a much poorer country than it is now. But tuition wasn't exactly free, but it was pretty close to it. Mm-hmm. And under the GI Bill, a huge number of people went to school at government expense, meaning no tuition, essentially, very low fees. I mean, I was a student back in the 40s at an Ivy League college, and tuition was about $100, maybe equivalent of $800 today or something. These comparisons suggest very strongly that there's no real economic reason for high student debt. So we have to then ask what it's doing. Well, it is part of a much more general process. Over the past generation, essentially 30 odd years, there's been a major assault on the population. Mm-hmm. Basically, the neoliberal era That's one of the reasons why there's now a slogan, the 1%, 99%. We're back to levels of inequality that among the highest in history before the Great Depression. There's been economic growth during these years, but it's overwhelmingly gone into very few pockets. Since by now, latest figures I saw, there are 400 people in the United States who have as much wealth, more wealth, in fact, than the lowest 180 million. Wages and have pretty much grown very slowly, more or less stagnated for most of the population, sometimes declined. While meanwhile, there's been enormous wealth going to a tiny percentage of the population. I mean, the 1%, 99% imagery isn't really right. It's more like 1/10 of 1% if you look at the way the graphs actually work. And that's led to lots of consequences. It's not an economic necessity, like it's not happening in comparable countries. And it's having, there are a lot of other effects. So, for example, the OECD, the Organization of the Affluent Countries, the so-called developed countries, they just did a study of social justice in 31 OECD countries. The U.S. was 27th, right above Mexico. You have to remember, this is the richest country in the world with enormous advantages that no one else has. And there are other studies of the infant mortality, maternal health, lots of measures. And the United States is way down at the bottom of the rich countries, around 20th, 21st, which is just totally scandalous. In fact, healthcare is a remarkable case. We have about twice the per capita costs of other rich countries and relatively poor outcomes, in addition to tens of millions of people dying every year because they don't have insurance. The new program will dig into that a little, but nowhere near where it should. For people who are worried about the deficit, which they shouldn't be, it's declining, it's not that serious. The deficit would be erased if we had a healthcare system like comparable countries. And the reasons are not terribly obscure. It's the only virtually privatized, lightly regulated system in the world, so it's highly inefficient with huge administrative costs, advertising, profit for the private companies, huge salaries, a lot of waste, cherry picking, all kinds of things. Which, in fact, there are a couple of parts of the U.S. system which are government run. One is the VA system, Veterans Administration. So that's kind of like European countries, about the same level of costs and efficiency. Medicare, which is government run, is much more efficient than the privatized system. The costs are going up, and there's a lot of talk about the burden of Medicare, but that's because it has to work through the privatized insurance system. If its own administrative costs and others are quite low in comparison. And it's kind of interesting to look at the proposals that are now being discussed. So one of the proposals for dealing with the deficit problem, which again is not a major problem. The banks care about it, the population doesn't, and they're right. But if you, one of the proposals that's being rooted around is that the age for Medicare eligibility should be increased. That's quite an interesting proposal. For one thing, it's got a class basis. Professionals, white-collar workers and so on, tend to live longer than truck drivers and construction workers and people doing hard manual labor. So as you move up the level in which Medicare eligibility comes, you're essentially arming the poorer working people, benefiting the more wealthy, educated sector. But even more interesting than that is the fact that raising the age is a move from a more efficient system to a less efficient system. So it's actually more costly. But the way cost is measured, and that's just ideological, it's not an economic necessity. If costs are transferred to individuals, they're not considered costs. It's only if it's a business, then it's a cost. If it's the government, it's a cost, because the rich don't like to pay taxes, and the business, of course, wants to have profit. So if you can find a way to transfer costs to individuals, that's called savings. You came up here today on the train. The train from New York to Boston takes about the same amount of time as when my wife and I took it 60 years ago. If you were in any European country or almost any country, it would take a third the time probably. And that's a cost, but it's a cost to you, not a cost to Amtrak or to the government. And it's the same if, I had to fly yesterday for some talks. If you fly in an airplane, in order to save money for the private carriers, they don't circulate air. Well, there's a cost to that too, like what you're hearing. One of the costs of not circulating air is it circulates diseases. So if somebody in the plane has a cold, everybody ends up with a cold or the flu or something. But that's a cost that's transferred to individuals, and therefore it doesn't count. You don't count it when you measure efficiency. Incidentally, this is happening at the universities too. Mm-hmm. As the universities get more corporatized, there's been during this period of sharp rise in tuition, not for economic reasons. I think there's also been an enormous increase in ratio of administrators to faculty. There's a couple of studies that just Benjamin Ginsberg, well-known sociologist, has a book on it called The Fall of the Faculty. It discusses the sharp rise in number of administrators and the tendency to have professional administrators. Universities used to have administrators from the faculty who took off for a couple of years and went back. But a lot of the administrators now are professionals. They're people come from business schools. They have a business school mentality, and you have to keep you have to look at the bottom line. Well, you have to save money. You have to get what's called efficiency. And they use the corporate economic model of efficiency. So if the costs are less for the institution, it's more efficient. For example, if you can reduce the proportion of faculty to teaching by getting temps, low-paid teachers, like say graduate students, who have low salary, will have low salaries, no benefits. If they can take over the work of highly paid faculty, that's efficient. It's not efficient for the students. They're not getting the same level of education, surely. And it's not good for the graduate students either. Mm-hmm. But that's called efficiency. Well, all of these things, there's a lot more like this. All of this is going on in parallel as part of the whole neoliberal onslaught, which is it's very harmful to the population, very beneficial to the masters, the super rich. They're doing fine. Like after they caused the latest financial crisis, the big banks, the perpetrators are richer than ever, bigger than ever. The corporate profits are reaching records, the bonuses are huge, and so on. The population suffers, but not them. This relates, incidentally, to some things that Occupy is doing. Mm-hmm. So among the, I don't want to go on too long, shall we continue? Well, among the Occupy concerns are things like in fact, one of the projects that's coming up is called Occupy the Economy, right. Deal with the tremendous concentration of wealth, which carries along with it the concentration of political power. That's almost reflexive. Cost of elections skyrockets. You have to depend on rich donors, corporate donors. It ends up kind of controlling the political system, which is shredding. You can see it very clearly. Go through some of the details. And going after that is a critical point.
Yes. So what kind of actions should we students, for example, at NYU, pursue? Obviously, we need to organize and create student groups addressing these issues that you have outlined. But what other more specific tactics would you suggest so that we can go beyond merely communicating this message about debt as a form of entrapment and indoctrination and move to demanding substantive change of some sort?
You could look at the model of other countries.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the ones on our borders, Mexico and Quebec.
Mm-hmm.
The protests in Mexico, remember, it was a protest against a small increase in essentially free education.
Mm-hmm.
But it swept a large part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
In Quebec, it drew in a large part of the population. It was tied to concerns of many other people. It's not just the students who are suffering from this. This attack on the population is much broader.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you have a situation in which, like what I described, what you all know, the kind of stagnation or something like it for the large part, even the majority of the population, while there is growth, especially for the poorer people, it's much worse.
Mm-hmm.
For the black population, the wealth was almost wiped out by the last recession. Mm-hmm. And if the student movement, in many places, in the United States too, historically, the student movements have been kind of in the forefront of large-scale social change. So, for example, the changes in this country, there's been a lot of progress in the country in the last 40 years or so. A lot of it came from student initiative. Take the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. There's been a civil rights movement efforts for a long time. But one major spur to it was around 1960 when a small group of black students sat in a lunch counter, kicked out, arrested, brutalized, and others came. Pretty soon you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you had freedom buses, students from the north coming down. It wasn't the whole story, but it was the cutting edge of what became a mass movement that achieved some goals, not all, but some goals. The women's movement, a lot of it came from young women organizing consciousness-raising groups, pressing demands. Finally, it spread. The environmental movement a lot of it has come from student activism, not 100%. The anti-war movement, it was very clear, it was mostly students. And this is true of many other cases in this country and elsewhere. So the students can become kind of a galvanizing force, and not just for their own personal concerns of, I don't want to be in debt for the rest of my life, but because it's part of a general social problem. It's part of a general attack, really is an attack on the population. And it should be possible to link up with other sectors that are suffering under the same attack in different ways. Like, say, people working for the minimum wage. There was a time during the period of growth, significant growth in the country, the 50s and 60s, when the minimum wage pretty much tracked productivity. That started to separate about 30 plus years ago. If the minimum wage had kept up with productivity, it would probably 2 or 3 times as high as it is now. Well, that means people working at the minimum wage are paying the costs of the wealth of the 1/10 of 1%. And when you pull down the minimum wage, you pull down all wages. Mm-hmm. These are all broad issues that the student movement can help galvanize, move forward with.
What do you make of the increased professionalization and specialization among undergraduate departments in universities? By professionalization, I I mean that the curriculums are under more and more pressure to respond to the demands of the market, such as getting a job, etc. In addition, and in tandem with this in some respects, it seems that there's a great push to make some fields seem as much as exact sciences as possible. For instance, the humanities seem to be under great attack because they do not produce tangible outcomes and assessments that can be fit onto a balance sheet determined by market logic. What should happen to traditional humanities disciplines from your perspective, given these pressures?
Depends whether we want to live in a civilized world or not. I mean, the wealth and richness of life doesn't come from having more gadgets in your hands. It comes from literature, arts, decent society, decent human relations, many other things that you can't put a number on. Marketization of life is another form of destroying it. This was well understood by the working classes in the early ages of the Industrial Revolution, in fact, all through their modern history. You go back to the 19th century, there's quite good scholarly studies of it. The British working classes, in Dickensian England, wasn't very pretty, had a very high level of culture. They were reading contemporary literature, what we call classics now, and the studies compare the proletarian culture with the Philistinism of the aristocratic culture. The same in the United States. You go back to the early industrial towns, right around here, in fact, eastern Massachusetts. The young women from the farms who were coming into the mills were bitterly condemned the fact that their culture was being destroyed. They were being turned into tools of production instead of independent women. An Irish artisan say a blacksmith in Boston, if he could get a little money, would hire a young boy to read to him while he's working. I can remember it. It went on into the 1930s. As a kid, my family, mostly unemployed working class, mostly in New York. A lot of them had never really had much formal schooling, a couple of years maybe. But they were going to Shakespeare plays and talking about the Budapest String Quartet, discussing the latest debates in psychoanalysis between Freud and Steckel, every possible political movement. And there was working class education, in which incidentally a lot of quite good scientists and mathematicians participated. There was work written for workers' education. There were workers' education programs, a lot of it run by the unions and so on. A lot of that's been beaten out of people's heads, but it could be restored. And that's a decent society. If you go back to the 19th century labor press, which is very interesting, it bitterly condemned industrial society as turning people into taking away their freedom, their independence, their integrity as human beings. In fact, wage labor in the mid-19th century was considered basically the same as slavery. The only difference was it was temporary. In fact, that was such a popular position that it was a program of the Republican Party in the mid-19th century. It was a program of the Knights of Labor, the huge labor movement that was forming. In fact, there was an interesting slogan that was emphasized by a lot of working people. The slogan that described what they called the new spirit of the age, that they're trying to ram down our throats. The new spirit of the age is gain wealth, forgetting all but self. That's been 150 years of massive efforts to try to indoctrinate people into that belief, but it's so inhuman and savage that it just doesn't work, except at the periphery. But that's the marketization of every aspect of life is part of this. If you go back to if you look at the colleges, the state colleges in the country, a lot of them are actually reducing in order to preserve the profitability. Look at the bottom line. Are actually reducing expensive programs where there are jobs, like they're reducing engineering, computer science, and nursing because they're expensive, but they happen to be the programs with jobs, and turning to cheaper programs. And as you say, the humanities are the kind of marginalized. You can't put a number on developing creative writers or individuals who can enjoy, who can appreciate and contribute to the arts and general culture. And that's a very harmful effect on the society altogether. So you have to decide what kind of a society do you want to live in. I think these are among the reasons why the U.S. ranks so low in, say, general social justice. Depends what values you have.
And in a recent public forum with Angela Davis, a veteran activist as well, you reiterated one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous statements, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And of course, it takes a lot of people to bend that arc down as well. But my question is, what role do universities serve in a just or democratic society?
Well, universities ought to be the place where as many people as possible, like say the GI Bill, have the opportunity to develop their creative capacities, their independence, their joy of discovery, their ability to work with each other to achieve desirable social ends that they can figure out. Students are at university, they're really at the freest time of their lives. They're out of parental control. They don't yet have to devote themselves to putting bread on the table. A lot of freedom and opportunity, and that's the point of a university. Actually, going back to Mexico, poor country, a couple of years ago, there was a leftist mayor in Mexico City. AMLO, he's called. He actually opened a university in Mexico City, which is not only free, but has open admissions with support for students who aren't quite up to the academic standards. And it's pretty impressive. I was there, visited it, talked to students, talked to faculty. That's just what a university ought to be. It ought to be open to, actually, it ought to be open to the community and draw people in, just like workers' education programs did. But these opportunities ought to be available to everyone, but they're at the forefront of creating the opportunities for a decent society in which a sane person would want to live.
And I'd like to shift to a different topic. In light of Barack Obama's second inauguration, what is your opinion about the role of the left in the United States? It seems to me that there is an effort among the Democrats specifically to depict the president as a victim of capitalist machinations. Is this effort a mistake? Should the left in the United States hold Barack Obama more accountable?
Accountable to what? There's no indication that he has any intention or ever had any intention or interest in bringing about progressive changes. He's basically a moderate Republican. In fact, it's commonly said now that the moderate Republicans have disappeared. The Republican Party is a party of, in fact, it's what the Governor Bobby Jindal called them a couple of weeks ago. He said, we're becoming the stupid party. It's so off the spectrum. But what happened to the moderate Republicans? They're now mainstream Democrats, new Democrats. And Obama fits pretty well within that spectrum. He came into office in 2008 with a huge popular support. And the country was going into an economic tailspin at the time. So the first thing he had to do, of course, was pick an economic team to deal with the problems. Well, take a look at who he picked. He picked people who had created the problems, what are called the Reuben boys. The ones who were at the forefront of deregulation, of building the big banks, of providing the government insurance policy, which encourages risk, the too big to fail policy, and so on. These are the people who were picked. Now, there are other highly competent economists, including Nobel laureates, people like, say, Stiglitz or Krugman and many others. They were never invited. And in fact, the business press, Bloomberg News, Business Journal, actually reviewed the appointments when they were made and had an interesting article about them, went through each person who was appointed and ended up concluding that half of these people shouldn't be on an economic team. They should be getting subpoenas. They're the ones who are the perpetrators of the crisis that we're now in. That gave it away pretty quickly. I mean, he came in, Obama, with huge labor support, and the labor movement had a few serious requests, good right ones. One of them was EFCA, card check, the ability to form. There's been a huge attack on unions, and they wanted to go back to a rational way of organizing, which most workers want, incidentally. Obama promised it, but forgot about it right away. Same on health care. A majority of the population favored some kind of rational national health care system. There was one residue of that left in Obama's program, Public Option, which he gave away, with about 2/3 of the population supporting it. The United States is, I guess, the only country where there's legislation that bans the government from negotiating drug prices. So drug prices are way higher than elsewhere. I found only one poll on that, which found that about 85% of the population was opposed. It made no effort to deal with it. I mean, the claim was, well, I can't get it through Congress and so on, but the president has a lot of power. Can appeal to the population, be a leader. There have been presidents who did do that, but you have to want to do it, or be pressured to do it by large-scale popular movements.
And you often associate justice with democracy, or democracy with justice, working in conjunction together. However, some may argue that the concept of justice and the concept of democracy are the antitheses of each other. In other words, the protections of personal liberties and majority rule are not compatible. NYU professor of politics Pasquale Paschino argues that by using the word democracy to encompass a broad range of things, the word loses any real value. And this can have a detrimental effect when we want to make substantive change happen. How do we resolve this paradox?
I think we resolve it the way Aristotle did. If you go back to the first major book on political theory, Aristotle's Politics, he was, of course, dealing with Athens, a city-state, and he was talking about free men, not people, so not slaves, not women, but he discussed various kinds of political systems, decided that democracy was maybe the least bad, so that's what we should prefer. But he pointed out there's a real problem with democracy. The problem is that if the voters, if everyone's free to vote, the ones who are enfranchised, the poor will use their voting power to redistribute the property of the rich. In other words, to achieve justice. And of course, we don't want that. He had a solution. But first, I should notice that Madison raised the same problem in the Constitutional Convention. He was talking about England, the model they're thinking of. And in the Constitutional Convention, he discussed the fact that in England, if everyone had the vote, again, excluding the people who are not allowed to vote, like women.
Mm-hmm.
But if everyone had to vote, the poor would use their voting power to carry out what we'd call land reform.
Mm-hmm.
These are mostly agricultural societies, and that's unjust. So Aristotle and Madison faced the same problem as the professor you're mentioning, the conflict between
Right.
democracy and justice, and they had opposite solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle's solution was to reduce inequality, and he proposed what amount to welfare state measures, on a city scale, not our scale, communal meals, things like that would reduce the level of inequality, and then you wouldn't have the poor, the mass of the poor, taking away the property of the rich. Madison's solution was the opposite. We should reduce democracy. And that's the way our system is constructed. You look back at the Madisonian system, the constitutional system. Power was to be in the Senate. The Senate, of course, was not elected, remember. Powers in the Senate, which, as Madison explained, constitutes the wealth of the nation. The more responsible set of men, those who sympathize with property owners and their rights. The executive was mostly an executive at the time. So powers in the hands of the wealthy. There is a House of Representatives, and that's more democratic. It was then, isn't now, but for all sorts of reasons. And that had much less authority and power because it was too democratic. And then there were other devices to factionalize the population and so on. Now, the population didn't really accept that. It was a radical population at the time, and there's long struggles through American history to try to achieve justice within a democratic system. And it's a bitter class war that goes on all the time. We're now in a period, last roughly generation, where the class wars turned sharply in favor of extreme wealth. So we not only have the distribution of wealth that I described, but it also has immediate consequences for democracy. And they're known. It's good work in the political science, the professional political science, studying attitudes and policy and the correlation between them. We have a lot of information about public opinion. Extensive polling, quite good polls, and the basic result that comes out of the kind of gold standard work, the Martin Gillen's, Larry Bartels, and others, is that about 70% of the population is essentially disenfranchised, the lower 70% in wealth and income, that their attitudes have no influence on policy. And as you go up the income level, you get slowly more influence. When you get to the very top, essentially get what they want. Well, it's a kind of democracy, everyone's allowed to push a button or something. But it's nothing like a functional democracy. And that's probably one of the main reasons why a lot of the population just doesn't bother voting. And it tends to be the poorer part. Nobody's really investigated it, but probably it's just an intuitive understanding. It doesn't make any difference. Why should I bother? But when you get to the House of Representatives, it's quite interesting. But that began in the constitutional system as a more democratic part of the government. Now it's the opposite. So in the last election, 2012, the Democrats got a considerable majority, but a small minority of the seats for all kinds of reasons, including legislative gerrymandering, the role of money in politics. There's a very good study by Thomas Ferguson, the main political scientist who studied the role of money in elections. And he's found that in the last congressional elections, there's almost a perfect correlation between the percentage of the funding that a candidate receives and the probability of the candidates being elected. So take, let's say, Republicans, and you look at the proportion of funding they received as it goes up, more are elected, almost in a straight line. And the presidential election, it was over $2 billion this time. Now, there's a lot of talk about how money didn't work because Sheldon Adelson spent $100 million and didn't get what he wanted. But that's not true. Everyone who funded got what they want.
Mm-hmm.
The candidates who are in office, thanks to the huge funding, are beholden to the funders. They're the ones who bought their positions effectively, and if they want to stay in office, they're going to have to go back to them. So that means they have to do what they want.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a big surprise that Obama, when he came in 2008 with huge support for the financial institutions, turned to shining their shoes, doing what they wanted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So it's neither democratic nor just.
And the point you made about voter apathy, I think, the point you made about that, I think it resonates a lot, especially with students in universities such as NYU. There's not only voter apathy at NYU to vote in general elections. I think there's just apathy about what students can do within their schools to demand some kind of change. For example, NYU is considering its next huge, massive expansion plan. It's called 2031. And of course, tuition is going to keep on rising. But virtually, students are completely not involved in the decision-making process. Faculty as well are not involved very much. So the administration is making moves and it is expanding. And the students sort of feel, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I don't have a voice, therefore there's nothing I can do.
Well, it's kind of drilled into our heads from childhood that there's nothing we can do. It's all too big. I think that's one of the reasons for the crazy gun culture in the country. Mm-hmm. A lot of people feel, look, I got to defend myself somehow from the government, from power or something, so I'll get a gun. Mm-hmm. It's not my government. I can't organize with other people and vote.
Right.
Actually, an interesting reflection of this is the attitude towards taxes. Mm-hmm. If you do a kind of a thought experiment and imagine a functioning democracy, what would people feel about taxes? Mm-hmm. Well, April 15th would be a day of celebration. Mm-hmm. We're getting together to fund the projects that we decided on. Mm-hmm. What's better than that? Right. Here, it's a day of mourning because some alien entity, big thing out there, is hovering over us and it's going to steal our money from us. Mm-hmm. That's a good indication of how low the conception of democracy is. Mm-hmm. And it's substantially because it doesn't bring about justice. Mm-hmm. If you want people to feel a function in a democracy, it's going to have to lead to a just outcome.
All right.
Before I gotta go.
Yes, and Professor Chomsky, thank you very much.